So what if your system just won't boot up? Can GRUB help us? Let's find out.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
Hello, welcome to LPIC 2. I am Zach and this is Don. And so now we're talking about some very interesting things, GRUB related maybe?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yep, GRUB is the most common bootloader used in Linux, and we've covered it in LPIC 1 for sure. But in this episode, we're going to change gears a little bit and talk about how we can recover a system using GRUB. It's got a lot of functionality in it. It's obviously a very important piece of our system, even booting up in the first place. So if something goes wrong with GRUB, usually you're locked out of your system. So we're going to learn how we can use GRUB to recover from that and get back up and running.
So can you give us a quick review of GRUB and how it works?
Sure. So if you're not familiar with GRUB, not a big deal, right? It stands for the Grand Unified Bootloader. It's an open source bootloader that is used by pretty much every Linux distro that's out there. And in fact, in this episode, I'm just going to keep saying GRUB, but it's actually GRUB version 2. And for a little while, people were running the old and the new, but now everybody's running GRUB version 2, so it's kind of consistent, which makes this episode nice because things are done the same on Red Hat, as well as Ubuntu, as well as Debian and Mint and all the various other ones that are out there. So things are nice. The way the bootloader works is when your system powers on, your BIOS or UEFI finds a bootable partition somewhere on the disk. Well, on that partition, the bootable part of it is GRUB. That's the bootloader. And so it's what's responsible for displaying that menu you sometimes see. If you have more than one version of Linux or more than one operating system, you may see a boot menu that comes up that says, what do you want to boot, right? So like when I boot my laptop, I see Windows 10 and Ubuntu and Fedora. I've actually got 3. So I pick which one I want and I boot to it. Well, that's GRUB. But once you pick who you're going to boot to, then it reaches over to launch the kernel and GRUB's out of the picture, right? So its job is to help you pick what operating system you want and then to launch the appropriate kernel. Now, if that sounds important, that's because it is. If something goes wrong, if it can't tell you the operating system, if it can't find them, or if it can't find the kernel, then you don't get very far in your boot process, and that's where GRUB really makes a big difference.
So what kind of problems can affect GRUB?
There's a lot of different things. I mentioned dual booting, right? So dual booting is probably the #1 thing that breaks GRUB. If I've got Ubuntu installed and then I install Windows 10, well, Microsoft is going to overwrite GRUB with their own bootloader. And believe it or not, I know this will be shocking, Microsoft's bootloader doesn't automatically detect Linux. So, there you go. The other way is not true, though. Like if you already have Windows installed and you install Ubuntu, it'll load GRUB, and GRUB does recognize Windows, and so it'll add it to the menu and everything's fine. But usually that's the #1 thing that breaks the boot process. If you have a separate operating system, maybe 2 different versions of Linux, right? Maybe I've got Ubuntu installed, and for whatever reason I install an older version of Red Hat, and it changes us from GRUB 2 down to GRUB 1, and now it's broken, right? That's the kind of thing that happens. It's possible the config files could become corrupt, but if I had to say what the #2 cause is, human error. Editing GRUB files is hard, and the syntax is really messy, so it's easy to make a typo, and then that will break GRUB as well. So #1 is dual booting, #2, human error typos. Those are the things that will usually lead to GRUB becoming damaged.
So where can we find the GRUB config files, though?
So sadly, while it is GRUB version 2 across all the distros, the config files can kind of be tucked away in a few different places. So let's start with the most common one. Normally, the GRUB file is found in one place, which is if you go into /boot/GRUB and take a look in there, you'll see grub.cfg. That's the configuration for GRUB, and that's where it's at. But if you were to open that file, one of the very first lines says, don't edit this file, right? Because we're supposed to make changes other places. So the GRUB configuration itself comes from, well, other places. If I go into /etc/default, in that folder, I'll see a file in here just called GRUB. And there's also a file called grub.d. Well, GRUB is the main configuration file. I'm going to open that up. Let me do a sudo edit of GRUB. This is /etc/default/grub. And here's where I'll see kind of general things like the default timeout. How long does it wait before going and loading the default operating system, and which operating system is considered the default. So I'll see options like that right in here. But I won't see operating systems. I don't see the operating system entries here that would be in the menu. And that's because those are actually coming from the grub.d folder that contains a series of, actually, hang on, it's a different spot. But there's a series of scripts that are actually going to be run that will automatically detect those operating systems. And that's why we're not supposed to edit the file, because it's automatically detecting things. And if we go and edit that config, the next time it auto detects, it's just going to overwrite it all. And so our changes get lost. And so we have to make sure to put those changes in the appropriate place. Now, I mentioned those scripts. I'm in /etc/default. Let me get into /etc/grub.d, the other grub.d folder. And there's all the scripts that I was talking about. So /etc/default/grub, that's the main grub configuration as far as its behavior. And then /etc/grub.d, that's the scripts that do the automatic detection of operating systems. And we've got a custom one even if we want to start adding in our own. So all of that is really what becomes the grub configuration file.
So if we can't be trusted to edit that file, how can we update it?
All right, so we can't edit the main grub.cfg file, the one that's found in /boot. I mean, you can, it just gets overwritten, so it doesn't matter. So we don't want to do that. We want to edit all these other files that I've been showing you, right? So if I want to go in and change the default timeout on the main menu, I would go and modify /etc/default/grub, and I would change that countdown timer. Mine was set at 0, so maybe I want to bump that up to 10. And so now it's going to wait 10 seconds before it picks whoever the default menu entry is. And then the default menu entry is usually 0, which means the first one, and that's that, right? So I could go there. If I wanted to add another operating system to my boot menu, or if I wanted to like fix a manual entry that I put in that is maybe wrong, then I would go into one of these, the /etc/grub.d/40 custom or 41 custom or a custom file that I've added in there, and that's where I would modify that. All these others are automatic detection, so you really don't need to modify those to change them. The key thing here, though, if you make any changes to these files, GRUB doesn't take those into account right away. We actually have to push that configuration to the grub.cfg file, all right? And there's a few different ways to do it, but the most common way is to use the update-grub command. So if you just run sudo update-grub, that command is going to reread all of those files, build it up, and then put it in /boot/grub/grub.cfg, right? So that's where it's going to end up. And if it finds any errors or whatever, it will not overwrite the file. So it has some protection in it. This is what's protecting us from stopping our system from booting. So if I ever suspect that my configuration has become corrupt, I'll just run this command, right? Update grub, push it in. On some systems, the command is actually update grub 2. If they still have support for grub 1, most people don't, but you might need to add a 2 to that. And also in the Red Hat documentation, they do a slightly different way of doing it, which actually works under Ubuntu as well. But you can use the sudo grub-mkconfig command. So that can make the configuration. This one has some nice options to it. For example, you can specify an output file. And so I could have it output to /boot/grub/grub.cfg, right? So that would update or basically rebuild my grub configuration. Or if I just want to see it, I could have it output to my home directory, right? So just write it to my home directory. So there it goes. It's building that grub configuration. And when I go into my home, I can see it right there, grub.cfg, and I can look at it and see if it matches what I want. So if you ever have a doubt about your grub config, that it might be corrupt or damaged or whatever, just sudo update-grub, rebuilds it, puts it in place, and you're back in business.
Well, okay, that's all well and good if there was some way that we can boot, but what if we can't even do that?
All right, that is true. So everything I've been doing is great because my system is booted.
It's booted.
Right? But if my system turns on and it just won't even boot, right? Maybe I get to a grub menu, maybe I don't even get to that, right? I push the power button and the BIOS tells me operating system not found, right? It could be that grub is completely gone. Maybe it's been damaged somehow. Well, in that case, it's not a matter of just config files. It's a matter of grub itself. And much like an operating system, if an operating system gets messed up enough, eventually one day you just wash your hands of it and say, you know what, format reinstall. Right? And then your computer's nice and clean and runs fast again. Well, that's what you have to do with grub, is sometimes if grub gets damaged enough or completely disappears, then you just have to say, all right, you know what? I'm just going to reinstall it. I'll reinstall grub. Now, you can do that without damaging your operating system, right? A lot of people get really, really nervous on this kind of stuff. Like, ooh, I don't want to. GRUB is like written to the beginning of the hard drive. It's the bootloader. If I mess with that, is it going to lose my data? No, it's actually kind of isolated from the rest of your data. Many of the GRUB files are in the /boot folder, which is typically on your main partition. But a lot of the GRUB files are stored in the master boot record, the MBR or the GPT. It's a little segment that's right at the beginning of a disk. On older disks, partition numbers started with 1. And a lot of people wondered about that. Like, computers always start with 0. Why do partition numbers start with 1? And the reason was that there was a partition 0. And that's where your bootloader was. And that's where GRUB writes to. So that's why we can write to that without having to mess with our other data. So it's a pretty safe thing to do. Again, when I have problems with GRUB, I don't usually troubleshoot it very much. I know that I can rebuild the config files really easy, and I know I can reinstall GRUB from scratch really easy. And so that's kind of the process that I want to follow to get the system back up and going. Now, Zach's question was, what if I can't even boot though? Right? I can't even boot. What am I going to do? Well, 2 choices. Well, you got tons of choices, right? But 2 that I'd recommend. Choice number 1 is get a live CD or a live USB key, right? If you have a USB installer for Ubuntu or pretty much any Linux distro or one of those live distros that's designed to run from a USB key, you can plug that in and boot from it temporarily. It'll have its own copy of GRUB on the USB key. You just have to tell your operating system or your BIOS to boot from it, right? Most computers, you press F12 when you boot and you pick that. The other option, though, would be to take the hard drive out and put the hard drive in another computer that is operational. And you can use that other computer to fix the one that's offline, right? It's the equivalent of booting with a live CD. Either way, you're booting off of some other operating system so you can see your dead drive. And in my case, that's what I'm going to do here is I've got a dead drive that is it's actually an Ubuntu server that just won't boot. GRUB is messed up. And so I want to reinstall, recreate, and put that all in place.
So, Don, we're talking about moving a hard drive from one computer to another computer. Aren't you afraid that might mess up the other computer?
Well, it's certainly possible, right? And anytime we're messing around under the hood in the system, there's a chance you could mess something up. So the solution is to be very, very careful. Not the best advice in the world, I guess, because what does that even really mean, right? So what I'll typically do is on the good system, I'll take a few moments to identify the hard drive that's already in there so that I'll be able to tell it apart from the one that I'm bringing in. I need to be able to differentiate. Sometimes it's as easy as just looking at what's mounted and what isn't, right? I've added that other server's hard drive to my workstation. So here, if I do a LSBLK, I can get a list of the disks and I see my drive, SDA, which is mounted, and now I've got an SDB that is not mounted, right? So pretty obvious to me which one is which, right? But if I've rebooted, you never know. Maybe you booted from the wrong drive. I mean, your operating system would look totally different, so hopefully you would know. But you could use the drive sizes to differentiate. My internal drive is 64 gigs. The server one is 256 gigs, so I can see that difference. But if I really want to be sure, UUIDs. The drive IDs, those are really going to show me what I need. So utilities like BLK ID, the block device ID, that will show you any kind of identifiers like that. But also LSBLK can do it. If you do a -F, that will show me the disks and their UUIDs. So if I took the time to get the UUID of my good system before adding this other drive, I'll be able to tell them apart. Since the other drive won't boot, it's kind of hard for me to get its UUID prior to installing it. So that's where, I just need to look at the good system. So I know that SDB in this case is that server drive, and I need to make sure that I only mess with it and not the others. Now looking at it, I see that it's got 2 partitions. So I see SDB1 and SDB2. SDB1 is the UEFI partition. So it's a little fat partition, FAT32, that stores the files that UEFI needs to find the operating system. And then SDB2 is where the actual operating system is. Now, GRUB is stored in 2 places, in the bootloader, which would really be SDB, and in SDB2, it's got the /boot folder as well as /etc/GRUB, so it's got things in a few different places. So those are what I'm going to need to work with. I need to mount SDB2 and bring it online, so I'll be able to get to where GRUB's files are. So to do that, I'm going to make a folder real quick. I'll just say sudo mkdir /mnt, and I'll call my folder /mnt/SDB2. You don't have to name it after the hard drive. Call it whatever you want, but this helps me keep it straight in my head. Then I'm going to mount it. So I will mount /dev/SDB2, and I'm going to mount that to /mnt/SDB2. And so now I have access to the contents of that disk. If I change into it and take a look around, that's the Linux install, right? And I can see the boot folder is right there and etc. And so now I can kind of get at those resources. I'm going to get out of it because not only do I not want to mess up my good system, I don't want to mess up the bad system either. And so if I start going in there and fidgeting around, I can really mess things up. So what I want to do is I want to reinstall GRUB for this system. So there used to be a very hard way to do that. But on every distro these days, we have a nice little utility called GRUB install. It's the same utility used to install it, and we can use it in this case to recover. I'm going to say sudo grub-install, and then if I don't tell it where to go, it's going to reinstall on this system, my good system. So I've got to tell it where I want it to install, not on my good system, right, on the one that's dead. So I'll say --root-directory equals, and for that, I'll point to /mnt/sdb2, right? That's where I've mounted, that's the root directory of this other operating system. That's where I want it to install GRUB. That's going to take care of the GRUB files, but then there's the bootloader itself. And for that, I'm going to point to /dev/sdb. Notice I'm not pointing to the mount point, right? It needs to write to the boot sector of /dev/sdb and not to a particular partition, to the disk itself, right? So that's very different than the /mnt/sdb2. Here it's the disk itself. So with that command, I can run it, and there it goes. It says it's installing for the i386 PC platform, installation finished, no error reported, so that's good. So it has now recreated the GRUB configuration and reinstalled it in that boot sector. So from here, I just take that hard drive out, go back to my other system, plug it back in, and power it on, and now I should have an operational GRUB. Now, I will say, if something caused your GRUB, your bootloader, to clear out for some reason, you may have lost other data too. So don't trust that your system is completely fixed at that point. Once you boot back up, start taking a look. Are your services starting? Is your hardware detected? Look for other issues. It can also be an indicator that your hard drive is going bad. And so when this reinstalls, if there's bad sectors, it'll write to different sectors, so that'll get you booted again. But it might happen again in the near future because sectors continue to fail. So if you've fixed your GRUB bootloader, just assume that there may be other problems that you need to dig for.
Ooh, and that's what Don means when he says be careful.
Be careful.
That's right. And before we move on, anything else you'd like to say?
Let me just recap the kind of three scenarios I set out for this, right? The number one thing where people end up breaking GRUB is when they dual boot, right? Other operating systems can mess with the GRUB bootloader. The second thing is human error, right? Typos in your configuration files. Definitely check for those. And then the third thing is, well, just like random corruption, that your disk could be going bad. Some other kind of problem can happen to cause the bootloader to be damaged or even disappear altogether. But fortunately, we got a few different ways to fix it, and those are the things we learned in this episode.
Recovery with GRUB. Great stuff. Thank you so much. And thank you for being a part of LPIC 2. I'm Zach, this is Don, and we'll see you again.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.